Kia ora, everybody. Welcome to this month's webinar, where we will be looking at digital asset management. Digital asset management, or DAMs for short, is all about the creation, organisation, management, and preservation of digital files, including media files. So that covers images, video files, audio files, and all kinds of sundry document files as well. We'll be looking at the broad stages in the life of a digital asset today, and we'll be seeing how Vernon CMS, plus organisation-specific processes, and possibly even a third-party digital asset management system can help with the management of your digital assets. Digital asset management covers several key stages in the life of those assets. So that starts with the creation of the asset, and that can include managing the workflow for the people that are responsible for that. So helping allocate or notify your photographers that there's a batch of objects that needs photography, for instance. The creation can include integration with the devices that are helping capture those. So integration with the scanning machinery or the photography machinery that you've got in place. And as part of the creation of the assets, a key part is setting up broad standards for what sizes and formats you're wanting to create and describing those assets as they're created. Once the assets exist, the next stage is to manage those. So people might be responsible for reviewing and approving assets when they're created, and you might be setting access controls around those, partly due to things like rights restrictions on the assets. Once the assets are there and you've set appropriate controls, you then want to share access to those. So providing ways for people to discover them, to reuse them, and to generate them in different formats for different end users. Lastly, we have to manage the archiving and the preservations of those assets, and that's often outside of what even digital asset management systems cover. So that's adequately backing up those assets. And then in terms of preservation, ongoing integrity checks, and migration between different digital asset formats as things become obsolete over time. So I'll start off by looking at how things within Vernon CMS can help you with the management of digital assets. Within Vernon CMS, we have key files covering all different things that relate to collections. The core file is the object file where we have our catalogue records, but digital assets are managed in a central file, which is the photo, audio, visual file, and that can be linked to any of the major files in Vernon. So any media files you have can be linked to any of the key files, like an image that was done for a condition report, an image of a gallery that was part of an exhibition venue, or the images of individual items in your collection. So let's search for an example digital asset. I've got a landscape photograph which I took, and I've got a catalogue record that describes that. Whenever we link an image or a video file to Vernon CMS, it automatically creates a thumbnail copy of that image. So that's what we're seeing on this screen. And that means that the system is able to quickly present a large number of images if you're switching to something like the list manager view. Within the system, that's stored as a link to wherever that source file is located on your network. If I double click on the image, it's at that point that it goes off onto the network and retrieves the original file and provides us a viewer where we could zoom in and out of that. We can also right-click on that image to get options like refreshing that thumbnail. So if somebody independently altered that image outside of the system, Vernon's not automatically going to detect that, but you do have the option of forcing the system to refresh that thumbnail. We can also go to Properties, where it'll go to the full digital metadata that's embedded directly within that original file. So that's going to have a whole range of different information, what kinds of color standards we used on the device that captured it, plus details of the context of when it was taken. So what kind of device captured it, what kind of compression, what size, what date it was taken. All of that's embedded automatically in the image by most common capturing devices. So things like a digital scanner or a camera will automatically embed this information for you. So those records in Vernon can link to one or more related photo, audio, visual records. So one particular object might have a dozen images that are all linked. Each of those images exists as a record in our central photo, audio, visual file. So we can see that on the left as part of the object section that I'm working in. And so if we had a dozen, they'd all be listed here, but in this case, I've just got one related photo record, and I can easily go to that related one with the Go To button on the top toolbar. So at this level, we're describing details that relate to just that one digital asset rather than the object as a whole. It might be that in this case, we have a physical print of it, and we might have had two photographs, one of the front of it and then one of the reverse where perhaps the photographer had signed it and written some notes. We can at this level override things like the caption to put a caption that's specific just to this one image. And places like Vernon Browser are sensitive to that and can show a different caption per image if you've recorded that at this level. So here we've got the link to the original file, and then we can record basic information that relates to this one digital asset. So we can say, for instance, the basic publication status of this. So can this image actually be shared? And some details about things like the production or the subject of it. We might also record some basic information about the rights that apply to that particular image. And then like we saw in the properties window back on the main object screen, we can also get an overview of the basic metadata that Vernon's been able to extract out of the image. And so that metadata at this point is stored directly on the photo record. And that means that it's data that you can search on within Vernon. So for instance, we can see the width and the height of this image. That's the real width and height of the image. But now it's something that we could search on using advanced search. So within the photo audio visual file, all of the metadata fields are fields that have been extracted from the digital asset and are fully searchable. So you might want to, for instance, retrospectively re-photograph the images that are poor quality. And we might tackle that by doing a search on the height or the width element. So I could look for everything that at a height less than 1500 pixels. And the system will find all of the relevant images. And I could click on Finish and bring those back as a set of results. And we can see, for instance, that that was an image which was 1100 pixels wide. And we might allocate that as a task to the photographer to retrospectively go back and redo the photography on those. If I go back to the higher quality image that I had, this is a link just to a working copy of that image. So normally within the system, you'd just be linking to a compressed, resized version in JPEG format, and that means you'll be able to use that file easily without it being a huge size to try and move around on the network. But you can optionally reference in Vernon where the high resolution original is stored. So as part of the documentation references page, you could use the external file to note where in the system, where on your network, those original digital files are stored. We can give some basic advice on the organization of those files outside of the system. If I swap to Windows File Explorer, we can see in my case, I've got two folders, one which is called Derivatives, which are the smaller working copy images that Vernon's accessing. And then we've got another separate folder for the originals. So if I go into Derivatives, we've got organization by year. and that's the source image that we were linking to within the system. We recommend using images that are around 2,000 to 3,000 pixels on the longest side, but then you may have an original quality image, which is a much higher resolution. And for those, we'd recommend keeping whatever the highest quality you have on the system that you created that in. So the scanner or the camera will create the best quality image it can, and we'd store that parallel to these copies. So if we go back up to that top folder, I've got an originals folder which parallels the same structure. And within that, I've got the original TIFF file, which was created by the device. Those files will be much more large and will be less easy to use day to day. If we look at this particular example, we can see that that's actually tens of megabytes. So it's not something you necessarily want people to be reusing day to day. You wouldn't want somebody to embed that in a Word document, for instance, but you'll sometimes need those high resolutions when you're using things like advertising or marketing material. If we go back to Vernon CMS, we also have the ability to generate other smaller copies of the file that's linked into Vernon. That can be done through the reporting module. So if I did a search on a group of records, maybe everything that was done by Crownland Potteries, I've now got 15 different records, and I could choose to run a report on those. I've already created a report which I've just called Image Derivatives Export, but I'll edit that report to show you what settings I've put in there. In any export or XML export format report, we can optionally export a folder of derivative copies of the images that are linked to those records. So rather than exporting just the text data of the records, we'll be exporting that plus another folder of image copies that we've made. And so we can control that through the formatting options of the report. We mark that we do want to export the related audio-visual material in a separate folder, and then we mark what subset of the images we're interested in. So you might want only the primary image of each record. That might be all that's necessary for this particular export. If we don't tick that, it will be all of the images. And then we could also limit that by the publication level. So maybe this is an export that you'll be sending out to a researcher outside of the organization, and you might mark that only the things that have full public access should be included in this export. We then just name the folder that we're wanting to send these to, and we can mark what sizes we're wanting to export. If we don't list a derivative size, it will just automatically create a folder just with the source images that Vernon's linked to. So whatever the best quality JPEG image that you have is, a copy of that will end up in this folder. There are a number of pre-built sizes in Vernon, going from nano, which is a very small size you might use on a mobile phone, for instance, up to extra large, which is 1200 pixels on the longer side. And you can create your own custom sizes for use in your own reports. So in this case, I've asked it to export the medium and extra large size image, and I could run that report now. And so that's going to work through looking at each of those source images and automatically creating those smaller sizes for me. So I could swap back to File Explorer, and I've got that derivatives folder which I asked it to create, and it's made two subfolders for the two different sizes I asked for. If we were exporting just the original sized images, they would just be directly in this main folder. And then I could go into the medium folder and I'd be able to see all of those resized images. And if we looked at the properties of those, they'll each be automatically resized to the size that I've asked for. In this case, medium is 400 by 400. That's the process we use for publishing to our Vernon browser web module as well. So all of these same settings are used to control which images end up on your public website. So if I go back to the report template page, I've got a saved report for Vernon browser. That report says which text fields from the record will end up online. But then we've also used those formatting options to control what subset of images from those records are going online as well. So again, we've limited it to only the things that are marked as full public access. And we've specified a list of derivatives which Vernon browser needs for the various results page layouts that it has. As well as keeping the source images linked to Vernon and the high resolution images separate, you also need to consider what your naming conventions are for your media files. So if we go back to that example folder, in my case, I've used a naming convention of the accession number of each object. And by doing that, we can bulk import new images and link them to the correct objects. We could have had additional text as part of that file name, provided we use a consistent punctuation character to separate the two pieces of information, the accession number plus any other notes in this case. So I could say 1999.8 side view, and because I've used an underscore, provided that I use that underscore everywhere in my image names, the linking process in Vernon can automatically separate the accession number out of that file name and then find the right matching object for you. So that bulk linking process is done through the Tools menu. Under Imaging, Import and Link Images, we just say where are the folder of images that we're wanting to import. I'll just pick my default images folder. And then when we say display matches, the system will go through file by file. It will find the correct related object, and it will tell us whether that image is currently linked or needs to be added. And then we can see some of those. It's found a new image, which I could relink. In my case, I've actually looked at the originals image. We'd only actually want to link the ones that were in that derivatives image folder. So I've got one new image for that object, which I could add in. So that's a way that Vernon can streamline the linking of the object records to the images as those are created completely independently of the system. And so that covers the key things that we're able to do directly within Vernon. You might consider using a digital asset management system to have more control over the different stages in the life cycle of these digital assets. We have integrated with several different digital asset management systems, and these are 4 examples that are already in use at different client sites for Vernon CMS around the world. So we've done integration with Photoware, Fiction, Canto, and Extensis. Digital asset management systems will cover a range of features that goes beyond what Vernon CMS does. Firstly, it can start managing the process before the assets are even created. So create job lists, for instance, for the photographers or scanners so that they know which things need assets created for them. So that might be a work list of new images that need to be created because you've purchased a whole group of new objects. They can also help manage the description of those assets. So there might be some basic cataloging that's done directly in the digital asset management system before that's even passed on to Vernon CMS. They can automate the standards of those files as well. So set your preferred format and resolution for images as they're created in the system, and they can dictate things like naming conventions for derivative images. So automatically generate that working copy that Vernon CMS needs and perhaps put it in a special designated place in the network for Vernon then to pick up as part of that import and link process. Digital asset management systems also usually include a discovery layer, so a web interface where you can browse those assets completely independent of the cataloging system or the Windows network, and better options for the reuse of those. So controlling who's allowed to access which different subsets of assets and provide easy options to access them through programming interfaces and to generate different copies for different purposes. This is often distinct though from digital preservation. And so this is a pyramid showing you how digital assets are managed through the whole preservation stack. At the most basic level, you're just wanting to securely store them. So store them on some kind of media which you know is going to be safe and reusable. So a hard disk typically, where those things are regularly backed up. The next layer is storage management. So the ongoing consideration of your future storage needs as they grow. So thinking about allocating more space over time, figuring out how that volume is going to be managed. The third level, which is the level that's often already going beyond a digital asset management system, is the ongoing validation of those assets. So automated processes that are checking that those files are still readable in the format that you expected them to be. We can then do information organization, so the description of those assets and the management of the technical data around them. And the processes, which is often managed by the digital asset management system. So things like the creation and the sharing of those assets. And then lastly, the most complex part of the process is the long-term preservation of those assets. So all digital formats become obsolete over time. And so the most complex part of digital preservation is the migration of those assets to different formats when a particular format becomes obsolete. That's less true for images, where things like JPEG formats have been around for a very long time. But for more complex formats, like 3D objects, that particular field is evolving quickly, and formats can become obsolete very quickly as well. And so you need to have strategies in place for how you migrate those formats to other newer formats when those become obsolete. Lastly, I've put together a few basic resources. So I'll switch to my web browser and show you those, but we'll be able to share them as links after the webinar. Our own Vernon CMS help website, which is just vcms-help.vernonsystems.com. has some general guidelines for image storage, including some recommendations for the image file naming. So that will help you most easily connect to those assets and manage them in bulk. I've included an article which just covers all of the basics of digital asset management. So looking at those different parts of the life cycle that we've gone over today. The Digital Preservation Coalition brings together a whole set of resources about digital asset management and preservation and goes in detail about how you can cover the different strategies to preserve your assets for the long term. And then there's also been a case study about digital asset preservation, and that goes into detail about all of the stacks in that pyramid that I described in the last section. Thanks very much, everybody. It's always a pleasure to see so many people joining in on our webinars, and we look forward to seeing you in our next month's session. Thanks very much.